Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen Yu. The word tariffs is trending these days because the US President-elect Trump has said more than a few times that he would impose hefty tariffs, starting with goods from Mexico, Canada, and China. Today, our guest is Wendy Cutler, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute. Wendy is best known as a trade negotiator in Washington, D.C., and over her nearly 3 decades of career at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, she has worked on bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP), U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. Welcome back, Wendy.
Well, thank you, Wenchi. It's my pleasure to be with you.
I'm sure you are in high demand these days, since President-elect Trump announced on Truth Social that on his first day in office, he would impose 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and an additional 10% to the existing tariffs on China to stem drugs and illegal migration problems from these countries. What do you think?
Well, look, Trump said he is the tariff man. We should expect tariffs, and that's what we all should be prepared for. That said, I think there are going to be a lot of these tweets or whatever we're calling them on social media these days from him, where he's going to threaten tariffs. And we're all going to need to sort out, are these threats or are these actions he's really willing to put in place? And with respect to that question, I think there should be no doubt among our trading partners that some of these actions will be put into place. And so everyone needs to prepare.
So I think after the first term of Trump, people have learned more about his style. And some people say these threats are just a tactic to get people to the negotiation table. But the actual, whether it's percentage or whether he's really going to impose those tariffs is still of question. And from some rumors in Washington, D.C., he actually hasn't really had a clear plan for any of the trade related policies. Have you heard anything else?
Well, look, his team is being formulated. I'm sure there are a lot of internal discussions on these issues because we already know there are difference of views among the folks he's bringing in to work on trade, from his USTR nominee, Jamieson Greer, who was chief of staff to Ambassador Lighthizer in the first term, is pretty hard line. And it's been pretty clear that he is on board to revoke China's PNTR status, for example. We heard yesterday that Peter Navarro's coming back, who's extremely hardline. But on the other side of the ledger, we've seen the appointments for Treasury, Commerce, and the National Economic Council. And those appointees seem to be more kind of mainstream Wall Street. They're talking in favor of tariffs because I think that is something that they need to make clear to Trump. They won't stand in the way. But I think there is going to be a lot of internal discussion and debate given the difference of views on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what the final policies are, his words certainly have sent a shockwave to the world. We see that Mexico's President Sheinbaum and Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau have vowed to retaliate and unite against Trump's threats. And Beijing's state media also said Trump is scapegoating China for U.S. domestic drug problems. And these are the three largest trade partners. Do you think they're prepared to have a trade war with the U.S.? And what tools do they really have?
And that's a great question. So every country is going to have to decide how they're going to respond to any tariff threats from President-elect Trump. And it was interesting with the announcement, as you mentioned, on Canada, Mexico, and China. There was a difference of responses, in my view. I think Mexico was the most out there mentioning the word retaliation. I think Trudeau kind of took a higher ground talking about U.S.-Canada cooperation. And once I can tell Trump, all we're doing in these areas, I'm sure that, things will be okay. So trying to take a high road and trying not to panic against every threat. And China, yeah, China made some noises, but again, I thought was pretty quiet versus their quick retaliation earlier this week in response to U.S. export controls on
Semiconductors.
semiconductors, chips, equipment, as well as addition to an expansion of entities listed under as entities we can no longer sell to under our export control list.
Yeah, I mean, since you mentioned semiconductors, and let's just, touch on that. We know that the Biden administration has been very focused on having a more comprehensive semiconductor strategy through the CHIPS Act and export controls. Um, what do you think the Trump administration is going to do? And if anything, that would be different. And specifically on China, how will China actually respond to potentially newer restrictions, or perhaps they're going to try a different approach with Trump?
Mhm. So, look, with respect to technology restrictions, I think we're going to see a lot of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. I
Mhm.
think there will be an effort by the Trump folks to try and tighten more loopholes and to try and get on top of new technologies that haven't been restricted yet. But again, a lot of continuity. Um, in terms of how China is going to respond, I think, their response this week against U.S. Semiconductor export restrictions was quick. And what did they do? They didn't impose tariffs. What they did is they imposed export restrictions to the U.S. of several critical minerals. And I think this was and is a signal to the new administration that whatever steps they take, whether it be export restrictions, investment controls, or tariffs, China is prepared to respond with its own measures. There will be costs to actions the U.S. takes. And I think this was, again, an important signal that China was sending this past week. Now, China has been preparing for a Trump return. They have many tools at their disposal, including increasing tariffs,
Mhm.
including, again, expanding their export controls
And
and
their
targeting
RMB. Yeah.
but and currency and targeting US companies. So again, I think they do have an arsenal of tools. They put in place over the past few years a
Mm.
legal framework that will allow them to respond quickly. And they've also been working hard at diversifying their trading partners to become less dependent on the United States and also to increase their self-sufficiency, again, to reduce dependence on the US. So, look, I think they're better positioned, they're better prepared, but at the same time, we have about $600 billion of two-way
Yeah.
trade with China. So our economies are still very integrated, and to turn that off overnight would be extremely disruptive, not only to the US and China, but to the entire global economy.
Well, that's the ultimate question. How far will both countries go? I mean, they're prepared, better prepared than the first term for sure. But you know, once imposed, it's hurting everybody. So how far would Trump be willing to go, and for what, to what end?
Mhm. And it will be interesting to see how he rolls out his tariff announcements. In my view, if he were to go forward and say, let's just say adding 60 percentage points onto current tariffs against China, you're talking about US tariffs then being as high as 85, 90% against Chinese imports.
Yeah.
And to me, that doesn't seem like a signal like we want to negotiate with you. I think that's more to achieve more disentangling the two economies and
Hmm.
decoupling. Let's just say if he rolls out a tariff against China and it starts at 20%, and then he says in 3 months it might increase more, maybe that would be a signal that he's more open to a negotiation. But
Mm.
I'm also very skeptical that we could sit down at the negotiating table with China and reach some kind of new trade agreement that would address our concerns with their unfair trading practices. China's moving in a completely different direction than we want them to
Hmm.
move in. In other words, their economy is becoming more state driven, more state involvement, more subsidies, more production. And so that to me seems like, how do you negotiate a trade agreement with a partner that has a completely different view of their
How
economic
to run their economy.
objectives?
Yeah. Well, you recently actually had an opinion piece in The Hill saying tariffs might not be an effective tool anymore. What do you mean? It sounds like it's related to what you had just mentioned.
Right. And my point in this opinion piece was that we are seeing a trend now of Chinese companies moving to third countries, particularly the ASEAN countries as well as
Right.
Mexico. Um, some in Washington think that the only reason China is doing this is to avoid US tariffs. I think that is a major consideration for certain Chinese companies, but there are many other reasons why Chinese companies will be investing in third countries, including being closer to the consumer in those countries. But the tariffs that are imposed against China, the way our tariff laws are written now, they would only apply to exports from China to the United States,
Directly to the
not
United States.
export from Chinese companies from third
Yes.
countries. And
Right.
so I think US policymakers are going to look at how they can restrict more effectively imports from Chinese companies in third countries. And
Yeah,
again,
we've
that's
seen that. I think Trump has threatened even during the campaign that he would look into Chinese factories in Mexico, right?
right. I think he threatened like a 200% tariff on
Right,
Chinese cars coming in from Mexico. So
right.
yes, that kind of threat is getting exactly what the point I'm making. But again, right now, the way the trade rules are written, you look at the origin of the product. You do
Hmm.
not look at the nationality of the supplier. And so this may change over time, but if we move to a world where we're also restricting the import of products made by Chinese companies in third country markets, that creates a whole new layer of complexity, and I think would really upset many of our partners in ASEAN who are looking to attract investment, including from China.
Right.
And so we'll have to see how this plays out over time.
Yeah, I mean, if he does use that new rule, I mean, not that, it has not had huge impact on world trade or economy. The question again is more than just the three countries he's announced. I think all over Europe, and also Asia, I think everyone is watching because clearly everyone will be affected, including Taiwan, because he said a few times what worries Taiwan most, obviously, is the semiconductors industry. He has said that Taiwanese have, stolen the jobs in this industry, and he actually thought that the CHIPS Act is not a good idea because it's using government subsidies, and so he proposed again using tariffs to attract foreign investment into the United States. How do you think? I mean, if you were advising the Taiwanese government, how or Taiwanese companies like TSMC, how should they think about or be prepared?
So, just to answer that question more generally, I think all countries need to be prepared. They need to work on different scenarios, right? Because Trump is so unpredictable, and one day he may be going after one industry or one company. The next day it may be against all imports from from that country. And so countries need to kind of think through their options for responses in response to different scenarios. But I do think overall, what we've learned from the first term, that there are ways to placate the president elect and to show him that countries are serious about addressing the concerns that he's raised, including agreeing to buy more from the United States,
Hmm.
including to expand investments in the United States, um, and also taking measures to get rid of their unfair trading partners practices, and also ways to kind of balance the trade deficit. And so in all of those areas, I think governments all around the world should be thinking about um, what tools do they have maybe to placate the president-elect from taking measures that he's threatening to take. And in some cases, there may be no way to do this. And countries may feel, governments may feel, economies may feel that they need to, retaliate and show their strength and show the president that there are costs to what he's doing. It's not cost-free.
Yeah. Well, clearly the US economy is very important to a lot of the economies. But I do wonder, right, adding the complication of geopolitics and Europe, we know now its economy is not doing that well. So would it come to the day or, the case that when perhaps the rest of the world is saying, let's just, give up on the US. Because you use the word placate. Yeah, it does feel like Trump is almost forcing everybody to kowtow to his demands. What if, other countries say, well, let's not do that. And instead, they coalesce and Europe getting closer to China for a more stable economic trade relationship. I mean, would that happen? And since the US seems no longer a reliable partner.
Look, it could happen, but my experience suggests that it's quite improbable. I think when it comes down to it, each country has their own national interests, they have their own politics, and are not going to want to be kind of part of a coalition taking on the United States.
Mm,
We've already seen this with Canada and Mexico, and each one kind of throwing each other under the bus, trying
yes.
to figure out what do they want, what's in their national interest. So I don't rule anything out in this new world, but I think what we're going to see are countries maybe talking about working with others in some kind of joint response, but at the end of the day, for their own national interests and their own politics, they're going to have to figure out their best strategy for working bilaterally with the United States.
Well, the other thing Trump also announced that was quite interesting is that he's putting U.S. Trade Representative, which is an independent agency, under the Department of Commerce. As a former senior official at USTR, how do you feel about it?
Well, first of all, what he actually said was a little different than what you're suggesting. And when he announced the new commerce nominee, Lutnick, he said something along the lines of Lutnick will be in charge of tariffs and trade, and he'll be working or he'll be overseeing USTR. It's one thing to say that, it's another thing to actually implement that, because if you're talking about somehow USTR being merged under commerce, that requires legislation, and that
Mm-hmm.
requires two very powerful congressional committees in Congress, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, to agree to such a reorganization. And if past experience has taught us anything, that is those congressional committees, for their own reasons, they don't want to give up their power on trade policy, and they would do so if indeed they allowed such a merger to go through. And so we'll have to see how this plays out in practice, but USTR does have legal responsibilities and is the negotiating arm of the United States government. What we may see, however, is that given that the USTR appointee, Jameson Greer, who's extremely experienced and a protege of Ambassador Lighthizer, is relatively junior to
Mm-hmm. Yes.
his counterparts in Treasury and at Commerce, and doesn't appear to have the same close relationship with Trump, particularly as the Commerce Secretary does. So that may suggest that it may be an uphill battle for USTR to kind of play the same role that it did during the first term under the skillful leadership of Ambassador Lighthizer. But as someone who personally knows Jameson Greer, I think he's an excellent pick. And given his experience and deep knowledge of U.S. trade policy and U.S. trade law, I think he's going to be someone who will be able to skillfully negotiate and implement what he's negotiated.
Well, we have to ask if you have any scoop on why Lighthizer is not returning to this upcoming administration.
I have no idea. I'm sure one day we will find
Is this a
out.
surprise to you as well? You,
Oh, yeah, I was quite surprised because if you think of cabinet officers during the first term that not only were extremely loyal, but extremely effective in
yes.
implementing what Trump said, that's Bob Lighthizer. And
Hmm.
so, yes, I was a bit surprised that he did not show up or has not showed up either in the White House or in one of these cabinet ministries. I was not surprised that if he was offered USTR as reported, that he turned that down. That would be very
Mm,
unusual for a cabinet officer to come back four
do
years
the same
later
job.
to the same job, particularly with respect to an agency like USTR, which is still, compared to other agencies,
Hmm.
very small and, not as prestigious as some of these other big agencies like Commerce and Treasury.
But I'm sure he will still wield his influence since, Greer seems to be, as you mentioned, his protege, and he's still viewed as someone who has influence and clout on trade issues.
Agree,
What else?
agree. And let's also keep in mind that Trump's first term, he did not have a great track record of keeping a lot of his cabinet officers for long periods of time.
Yes,
So you never know whether Lighthizer may reappear if indeed he's not part of the current,
the
team,
first tranche. Yes.
the first tranche. Yeah.
What else should we expect in the first year of the Trump administration in terms of other major trade and economic
Yeah. So
policies?
there's been a lot of talk about tariffs, but let's also remember that Trump liked to negotiate trade agreements. And during the first term, there was the phase one agreement with China, phase one agreement with
Mhm.
Japan. The USMCA was negotiated and implemented, and FTA negotiations were launched with the UK and Kenya. And he also renegotiated the US Korea FTA. So I think that we may have a trade negotiating agenda again. Clearly, that was put on hold during the
What about
Biden years.
Taiwan?
We'll have to see what progresses with Taiwan. I mean, the
Mm,
Biden administration worked hard to conclude the 21st Century Initiative with Taiwan. My understanding is like the first half of that agreement is in place or will soon be in
hmm.
place, but there have been some snags in the second tranche of the negotiations. So we'll see if the Trump administration decides that they want to take a totally different approach or they want to finalize this agreement. Time will tell what their approach towards Taiwan will be.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy. I know, he's not even in the office, and there's all kinds of speculations. Hopefully in 6 months, we'll have you back to help us understand some of his earlier actions, which I'm sure will be surprising and consequential to the world. Really, thank you for coming back to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.